Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on OMTimes' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome to the final episode in a special three-part series of interviews with former minister, researcher, speaker and best-selling author Paul Anthony Wallis, based on Paul's latest work, the Eden Trilogy, which has been hailed as an extraordinary work of investigation that not only brings much humility and insight to one of the most contaminated fields of inquiry, 21st century ufology, but also provides a solid foundation in understanding humanity's origins. If you didn't catch the first two episodes of this series, Paul Wallis is a senior churchman who served as a church doctor, a theological educator, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. He's the author of numerous titles on Christian mysticism and spirituality, and his work probes the world's mythologies for their insights into human origins and human potential. Paul, back.
G'day, Sandie. It's great to be with you again.
You too. And thank you for getting up so early to take part in this third interview in our series. So, Paul, Echoes of Eden, the third book in your Eden, it begins with an account of a hypnotherapy session you had with family and Charles Barbara Lamb in 2021, which brought back the first few moments of an encounter that you had in 1985. Tell us a little bit about that encounter and the impact it had on your life.
Certainly. Well, I teased readers with this experience in the second in the series, The Scars of Eden, and bit by bit through that book, I was remembering fragments of things that had happened when I was 20 years old. And it was significant for me, and it was almost happening in real time as I wrote The Scars of Eden, because when I embarked on this journey into paleo contact with escaping from Eden, people started contacting me because they wanted to share their experiences. But because these experiences are held very closely and people don't want to be shamed or ridiculed, they would test me before they shared what had happened to them with questions like, Paul, have you ever had a close encounter? And early on, I'd say, no, I haven't personally, but I have many friends who have. And that would be enough for us to get into a conversation. But the more I listened to other people's experiences, the more I thought, wait a minute. Something very similar to that happened to me when I was 20. And by the time I'd completed The Scars of Eden, I realized that I had experienced 5 close encounters in a single year when I was 20. Something odd was going on in that year. But with each situation, I was just remembering the first few moments, a fragment of it, and then not knowing how it resolved or what happened next. And so at the end of Scars of Eden, I'm about to go into Barbara Lamb's office. And then in Echoes of Eden, I actually do go in for a session. And my story is not one with a huge punchline. I did not suddenly remember all the rest of the stories, the things I couldn't remember, the lost time I hadn't retrieved. But what did emerge from that session was the significance of those encounters to the trajectory of my life. Because what I didn't realize at the time was that it had turned me into a restless seeker who would not be fobbed off with explanations of life that didn't actually meet the data. And that included my very neat and tidy evangelical theology, because at the age of 20, I'd been a Christian believer for about 3 years, and I lived in a neat and tidy world where everything had to fit into various boxes. An experience was either God, the devil, angels, demons, human, animal, vegetable, mineral. or it wasn't anything. There weren't any other options. And so when I had these strange experiences, I had to try and squeeze them into one of those boxes. I had to interpret the positive experiences as something angelic and the frightening experiences as something demonic. But the more I read the Bible and the more I studied theology, the more I realized those were not accurate descriptors for what happened and for what I had experienced. And it made me alert to all the non-explanations I was going to come across in my theology and in the world at large for the next 30 years. So if ever I was reading something in the Bible and I thought, well, that doesn't fit the stories we tell, I would notice it. If ever anybody had an experience that did not fit the neat and tidy world of Orthodox Christianity, instead of brushing it under the carpet or tell them you must have remembered that wrong, I would note it and think we have not understood that yet. And that impulse to listen to the forbidden stories, to look for the hidden layers, really informed the shape of my entire journey in ministry. I was 33 years in church-based ministry, and for much of that time I was a church doctor. And an archdeacon in the Anglican Church is a kind of church doctor. And if you can't find the hidden layers of stories in communities where you're going in to fix problems, well, you're going to be useless. You have to be wired that way. So it shaped my ministry, but it also meant that at some point I was going to have to go back to all the anomalies in the Bible I'd picked up and all the anomalies in our storytelling within Orthodox Christianity that were actually red flags letting me know there was a whole other layer of story in the Bible that has nothing to do with God's story as we understand it, but is actually the curation of our ancestors' memories of ET contact. So it took about 30 years to percolate through my system, my thought system, and get me onto this track. But those encounters when I was 20 really have ensured that I landed here and did this work and then shared what I've discovered with the world through my broadcast, through the Fifth Kind, through the books. So it's more significant than I thought.
Yes, absolutely. You know, it never ceases to amaze me. I speak to so many people, obviously, in all of these interviews. And when you look back over the trajectory of their life, it was the perfect setup. You know, they thought they were doing one thing, but they were skill gathering all the way. And suddenly, boom, then they find out the reason why.
That's exactly right. That's certainly how it feels. And now that I'm confronted with people contacting me from all around the world every day of every week to share anomalous experiences or research they've made that they can't square with their worldview, yes, those 33 years have prepared me for engaging in these conversations and sharing the processing with people in that position.
Yeah. Were you engaged in prolonged research and extensive travel to piece together, you know, the written and oral history? And it did cost you your reputation, your income, a career, and some friends, but you also uncovered what you describe as like a treasure trove of disclosure and suppression, secrets and revelations. So was it a fair trade, do you think?
Absolutely a fair trade, because like many of the people who contact me, I have an appetite to learn that I've not had since I was a youth. I want to know the truth of things. I want to know what's going on. I want to know what's possible for you and me, what kind of human experience we can have. And no, I wouldn't trade that for the world. And in fact, the work I do now in personal coaching is the most fulfilling experience I've ever had of pastoral ministry, where I'm engaging with a huge range of people from all around the world. We're talking at very deep personal levels, doing work that's actually helping people make a journey, absorb information, reorient after an anomalous experience, whether in the present or in the deep past of their lives. It's an amazing time. And there is a shadow side to it, as you say. I have lost a couple of friends through this who just really don't want to talk to me because they're scared of this territory. you break a taboo and it offends people to the point where they won't read my book. People who've read all the other books I've published on spirituality and mysticism won't even read the book. They just know they disagree with it, and they know they don't want to talk to me anymore. And when it's people I've known for decades, that's a bit surprising and a bit disappointing. But, there was a moment when I was preparing for the publication of Escaping from Eden, and I was sort of counting the cost of doing it. And I was having a conversation with myself and the universe, thinking, and I asked the precise question, how many friends am I going to lose through publishing Escaping from Eden? Because I love my friends. And I just sat with that question for a couple of hours and then sat down and I watched an interview. It was Regina Meredith interviewing a fellow whose name I've suddenly blanked on. And he, the guest, spoke these words. He said, of course you'll lose friends, but you'll make thousands of new friends who will think you're the bee's knees because of what you're talking about and of how they are now able to connect with you and process the experiences of their own lives. So you will gain far more than you lose. And that was the universe's answer to my question. I only had to wait 2 hours for the answer. And it's proven absolutely correct.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So since publishing the first 2 books, and I really enjoyed the third one, it brought so much together for me. You've met with many elders, obviously, and guardians of traditional cultures who carry knowledge of those ancestral memories of ET contact. Tell me about some of the secrets that have been hidden from us and why you say they have such urgent relevance for us today.
I think one of the most pleasant and exciting secrets that I uncovered in this research from conversations with guardians, elders of traditional cultures, initiation cultures, was the realization that we live in a soup of company and that every one of us is surrounded by an invisible team of helpers who want to support our journey through life. Now, I had heard that kind of language in the past from people I would have labeled as New Agey, but through my own research, I was realizing that's in the Bible. That's in Hebrews chapter 12. That's in 1 John 4. And then when I started hearing it expressed in other language by my friend Troy, for instance, who is a guardian of the Navajo tradition, or spoken by Nangas and Sangomas of South Africa and Zambia, I realized this worldview belongs to humanity at the grassroots level all around the world, and it actually marries with my own experience. In fact, in coaching, I will very often say to people, do you know, I'm beginning to suspect that each one of us has an invisible team of helpers nudging us through life, giving us little assists, supporting our journey through life. And I have yet to say that and not have the other person say, I'm coming to believe that too. And they're coming to believe it not because they've been taught it, but because they are experiencing it. And in fact, as they reframe their worldview, they're beginning to allow themselves to acknowledge that this is what's been happening to them. And so it's been very interesting talking to people whose awareness of that is generations old. So Troy, my Navajo friend, would be one of those. And early in Echoes of Eden, I talk about his experience of initiation in which his elders taught him to tune in to the environment around him so that he could begin to pick up on what the ancestors may be saying to him or what other spirits or other entities might be offering him by way of information or guidance. And what Troy told me parallels in what I heard from my friends in Australia who have gone through initiation experiences out of the Aboriginal Australian tradition. And the similarities of the protocols they use for tuning in is really, really interesting. Plato is another person who features
I was
in
just going to
Echoes of
mention that,
Eden,
yes.
just as he did in the Scars of Eden. And he's an example of somebody who was taken away on retreat. He says this happened to Socrates, his mentor, but he describes the experience with such interiority. I'm quite convinced he had this experience himself. Maybe the two of them had it, but he was taken away on retreat and then taken through a supervised tea ceremony, which had mind-altering effects to tune him into the conversation that was going on between us and beings in other dimensions. And his experience of that was life-changing for him. And the information that he gleaned from those close encounters informed a huge chunk of his writing, which has been taken incredibly seriously and with enormous respect for 2,500 years. There's a British philosopher and mathematician who once described the entire Western tradition of philosophy as no more than a series of footnotes to Plato. And nobody disagreed with him. That really is how significant Plato is. And what I did not learn in theological college was a lot of his insight came from these close encounter experiences in an initiation ceremony. So those are three, for instances. We've got Aboriginal Australian tradition. We've got the Kukion ceremony of the Eleusinian mysteries that Plato talks about in ancient Greece. Mm-hmm. And then we've got Troy, who speaks for the Navajo tradition. All around the world, different periods of history, but it's really the same thing they're talking about.
Well, you say that from Hermes to Socrates, both the Greek fathers, the Nag Hammadi texts, Giordano Bruno, woven together in their works are the themes of a populated universe, contact experiences, heightened consciousness, and human potential. You know, you paint a very deep and a very solid picture of how all of this has been taken away from us, through millennia, systematically has been covered up, taken away, ridiculed, and we have been conditioned to think that we do not have access to any of this.
Yes, we have. And we've been conditioned by all kinds of different powers. So it's not like it's the same group that's continually trying to keep this information to themselves. You can look at the history of imperial conquests through history, but it's very graphically exemplified in what happened when the Catholic forces of Spain and Portugal went into Central and South America, where there was a very violent attempt to delete and replace the culture that existed there. Now, Mayan culture was a written culture. And so deleting the culture of Central and South America meant burning libraries full of volumes of knowledge and information. And it involved slaughtering all the literate people, that's the priests, who could read those texts, so that if any of those texts survived, nobody would know how to read them. And then replace all that with Catholic schools, Catholic churches teaching Christian orthodoxy. That's just one, for instance, of what's been done through conquests all through history, where the invaders have to take charge of the narrative. That's the narrative of everything. Who we are, what is the correct story of origins. They have to have full spectrum dominance in terms of being the education system, the worldview definers, the arbiters of what's true and false, what's news, what's fake news. And it can be done in less violent ways as well. And in Echoes of Eden, I talk about the Ghana experience, where between 1874 and 1950, Ghana was under British rule. And if you were a young person in Ghana wanting to get on, then you would learn to dress British, even though it was quite climate inappropriate, and speak the Queen's English, and think British, And to the extent that you could do that, then you were a good candidate for a good job, promotion, so on and so forth. And you would be embarrassed by any relatives of yours who persisted with the old ways, the pre-British Christian ways. So if you had a mum, an aunt, a grandma who was a shamanic healer, then all of a sudden, oh, we don't talk about her. She's a witch doctor. She's an idol worshipper. And you cut yourself off from your own heritage, your own indigenous knowledge, because you're embarrassed by it. And it's a horrible thing to do. And it's horrible when you see people having to buy into that because they have to appease the invaders. That was the Ghana experience, and that's part of my own heritage. But I grew up in England, and it wasn't so different there, because instinctively I knew to avoid that woman who never cuts her hair, who lives in that tiny cottage on the edge of the forest and the field, and who knows about all the local flora and fauna, who knows all the legends of the area, knows what to do with the local plants, can offer you alternative medicine, but don't go near her because she may be a witch and she's probably insane. And it didn't actually have to be spoken. You just knew that from all these cultural signals that have been going on for hundreds of years in England. So really what the British did to the Ghanaians, it did to the English as well, and the Welsh and the Scottish, so on and so forth. So it's a very, very big picture, but it happens all around the world, all through the ages. And in the Scars of Eden, for instance, I talk about how even in the Bible itself, you can see the process of suppression building up and up until Judaism becomes monotheistic and forgets everything it ever knew about paleo contact.
It's interesting. I mean, it has gone on since forever. We can't blame necessarily one faction. We can't say, oh, it's the Catholics or it's the Jews or it's the Illuminati or whatever. So how to hold? Why does it keep repeating over and over again?
I think part of it is very simple, that whoever the governing power is, so whether we're talking about the cleanup of Judaism by the high priestly family of the Jerusalem temple, or whether we're talking about the burning of witches by the British government, or we're talking about the illegalization of Native American initiation in the USA, essentially what it is governments always want to be able to manage the populations they govern. That's their job. And so they're not really into anything that is going to empower other leadership structures. So, shamanic elders, no thank you. They're not going to want to empower other sources of information. If the government says A, B, and C is true, they don't want community leaders standing up and saying, yes, but our transdimensional guides actually say that D, E, F is true. Of course, no government wants that. They want to be able to set the agenda. And so whatever the culture we're looking at, it's the powers in power who want to disempower the grassroots and any indigenous kind of priesthoods or mysticism or shamanic structures or shamanic protocols. They would much rather have a population who can be managed and aren't too au fait. And even that dynamic is there in the Bible. It's there in Genesis 3 as the Elohim, the powerful ones, have an argy-bargy over how informed, enlightened, intelligent the human beings should be. And one faction says they're not happy, we need to upgrade them. They can be a bit more like us and have a fuller, more enjoyable life. And then the more dominant faction says, no, we only want them smart enough to be able to work for us. And we're going to keep them at an animal level. And we downgrade them. And there are 2 downgrades in the Bible.
Yes. And you cover that in the book where you talk about how, we once had access to so many cognitive abilities that we do not have now, that we were neurologically interfered with, so that we lost his. Why was that?
Well, the Popol Vuh is very frank about that. And it's one of the reasons I really love the Popol Vuh. And that's the story of origins from out of the Mayan tradition, from a document that was translated in Guatemala in 1700 by a Dominican friar, Francisco Jimenez, who was clearly a wonderful man, because after a couple of centuries of colonization and oppression by European powers, he arrives as a priest of the Catholic Church, but wins the trust as the pastor of the parish of Chichicastenango, to the extent that the secret survivors of the priesthood of the feathered serpent offer him their book. And they say, this is our story of beginnings. Would you be interested in reading it? And he was not only interested in reading it, he worked on it for years to translate it into Spanish, to bring its information to the world. Very respectfully to the Catholic powers, these are just the local folkloric stories, nevertheless, full of information and cognitive powers. Here's where they come into the Mayan story. The Mayan story says that when our ancestors were visited at a time of cataclysm in the planet's history, those who visited our ancestors started working on us to turn us into Homo sapiens. So what we were when they arrived, I'm not quite sure, but they were working on us to turn us into a Homo sapien smart enough to work for them, but not so smart that we didn't want to work for them. And it says it took them a lot of experimentation to get this right, and they made a lot of mistakes along the way. And the experiments resulted in us plus the ape-like creatures that live in the forest. And so what the story owns up to is that they were engineering something like a gorilla, which was very capable, but had no interest in bringing them their slippers and their afternoon tea, and thinking, well, we got that wrong. And when they come to the final stage, it involves something artificial, a splicing of their DNA with ours to create something smarter, more amenable to them having this relationship with us and getting us to work for them. Only the result was us plus Homo sapiens, 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 us plus higher cognitive powers. And the way those powers are hinted at in the text, it says that our ancestors were smarter than us in that their vision was not limited, that they could see further and deeper than we could. Well, how is our vision limited? Our vision is limited by surfaces. We can't see through things, behind things, or into things. Our vision is limited by distance. We can't see beyond the horizon. We can't see into deep space. It's limited by time. We can see the present. We can't see the past. We can't see the future. It's limited by frequency. We can see this spectrum of radio waves. A dog can see this. A cat can see this. So if you take those limits off, and the Popol Vuh says those limits were off in the beginning, then all of a sudden you've got X-ray vision. You can see into things with all the implications for self-healing that brings. And you've got remote viewing. You can remote view the rings of Jupiter, which was done in 1973 by Ingo Swann. You can see the past. You can see the future. You've got precognition. But what the genetic engineers found, according to the Popol Vuh, is that you cannot possibly manage a population as intelligent as that. How can you hoik and herd a species that knows what you're thinking or knows when you're coming? And, you know, there was a bit of that in the conquest of North America. How do you ambush a group of people who know when you're coming? How do you deceive a group of people who know what you're thinking? And so for the same reasons, initiation ceremony was illegalized in the USA between 1880 and 1980. So it's really the same story. It's a matter of having us bright enough that we're a useful workforce, but not so bright that we can't be managed. And there are all sorts of levers that can be pulled. The Popol Vuh says this was done by spraying a vapor over human populations that would damage us neurologically, limit us to our 5 physical senses, so we can only see what's immediately around us, and for any other information, we're dependent on an authority to tell us what's what. They felt they could work with that. In the ethics story from out of Nigeria, it's done by releasing devices into the environment that make us ill or anxious. There's another wonderful mythology called Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe, that shows that if you keep the public entertained enough, then they just won't be thinking at a higher level. So those are all the stories that really equip us to understand who we are, what we're capable of, and to realize that absent of toxins in the environment, absent of distraction, we're actually capable of far more than we think we are.
Yes, absolutely, and they all sound very familiar, don't they? There's many
Yes,
people
they do.
who, look at the chemtrails and say, "There they go again."
Exactly. I think that our ancestors bequeathed us these stories not just to tell us what happened to them in the past. They do want us to know that, but they tell us these stories so that we will be equipped to live in the present, so we will know what to look out for.
Yeah. But some, that whatever dumbing down was done, that those qualities, those abilities, are still in our DNA. We still have access to them.
Yes,
we
we do.
To find a way to turn them on.
Exactly. Most people catch glimpses of this in their own experience. Almost everybody will have a story of a flash of precognition that they had, or they'll say, I always know it's that person on the phone when it rings. Whatever time it rings, I just knew it was that person, or I knew something had happened to such and such. I don't know how I knew. We all have flashes of it. And then the initiation cultures that have survived all our attempts at suppression, they still have protocols for reactivating these higher faculties. Shamanic traditions all around the world are interested in switching our precognition, remote viewing, X-ray vision, so on and so forth, back on. And beyond that, our ability to manipulate the secret rules that govern the universe, which was really the whole agenda of Hermeticism. You can hear that re-expressed in initiation cultures all around the world, and they will have different protocols, sometimes very similar protocols, which are simply designed to help switch our brains back on and get everything connecting once again.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a short break now, Paul. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and you're listening to the 3rd episode in a special series of interviews with researcher, speaker, and former minister Paul Wallis, who is author of the best-selling series Echoes of Eden, The Scars of Eden, and the latest one, which is
the original one, was
actually the first one from Eden. Escaping from Eden, As from Eden is the latest, and that particular book raises the question: what secrets of human potential were buried with our ancestors' memories of ET contact? So, after the break, wormholes, portals, NASA, the Pentagon, and a lot more. We'll be back with more from Paul in a few moments.
OMTimes TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. OMTimes Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, OMTimes offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an OMTimes magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on OMTimes TV and broadcasting it across the extensive OMTimes radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. OMTimes. Open yourself to the possibilities.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Welcome back, Paul Wallis. In Echoes of Eden, you share some incredible stories from some of the many, many people that you've met. There's one in particular that I'd like to today, and that is the one of Lieutenant John Montgomery, whose otherworldly encounters, tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq, brought him to Mordor, wrestling with things of human contact. Human origins and paleo contact. Tell us a little bit about John's story.
Well, John's story is typical of many that I've heard from people who contacted me who are veterans of the 2003 incursion into Iraq. And after I published Escaping from Eden, I started having a regular flow of calls and requests from this particular demographic. The reason for that was that in Escaping from Eden, I included the story of Jörg Fassbinder, who had gone in with a team about a week after the Allies went into Iraq. So this is how important it was to our incursion into Iraq. Less than a week, they were in on an archaeological mission. And it was to retrieve the sarcophagus of Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is the crossover king in the ancient Sumerian story between the ETs, the sky people, the Anunnaki, and human kings and queens. Gilgamesh was a hybrid who was the pivot between those two phases of history. All of a sudden, if this really was the tomb of Gilgamesh, we could test whether that was story or whether that was history. So this was perhaps the most important archaeological find of all time. Jörg Fassbinder talked with the BBC, was so excited about the find, showed the data that supported the conclusion, and then everything went silent, and we never heard anything about it again until I think it was 5 years later. He was talking to a French magazine and he said, we decided not to pursue it any further. We thought it'd be safer just to bury it, to protect the site. Well, really? You've gone to that effort to get to the site. You've got military who've cordoned off that area so you can get those artifacts for testing, and then in the middle of that process, you change your mind? I don't think so. I felt heartbroken for him, because it was the find of all time, potentially. He had made it, and now it was being buried, covered up. Well, after I shared that story, I started hearing from servicemen who had been in Iraq, who had gone into Iraq believing they were going to save the world from weapons of mass destruction, to save the Kurds from slaughter, to save Iraq from despotism. These were all the reasons we were told we were going in. They went in, and war's a very layered thing. Maybe all those were true, maybe none of those were true, but the people who contacted me said they got there and their unit was doing stuff that had nothing to do with any of that. They got there and discovered they were on an archaeological mission. And what did I know about portals? And the reason they made that jump was because as they listened to their peers, especially as they came back and sort of found each other once they got back, they found some had been boxing up what looked like museum artifacts. Some had been boxing up sand and shipping it out of the country, and others had been specifically looking for Stargate technology, ancient technology that could create wormholes for travel. And so they would ask me, what's the credibility of that? A lot of them would say, I didn't have hands on, didn't have eyes on that particular mission, but I've heard about it from my peers. What's the credibility of that? Now, I haven't had eyes on or hands on, but what I've been able to say is that if you read the ancient Sumerian texts, they relate to that part of the world. And they do talk about Stargate technology, especially when you read the Sumerian narratives alongside the Bible. Yes, they say there was Stargate technology. Yes, they say it was in what we would now call Iraq. So there's that credibility to it. And then you only have to go onto the NASA website, and this is all public information. The Advanced Propulsion Unit has been studying stargates and wormholes for at least 30 years. 30 years ago, NASA had identified wormholes, and there's one very particular one very close to our planet. It's about the size of our planet. It opens on an 8-minute cycle. They have flown around it in drone craft. They have measured the mass of material that travels through it. So it's a real physical thing. 30 years ago, the propulsion unit of NASA was asking the question, can we fly one of our craft into it? And then what happens if we fly a manned craft into it? Now, that's all public information. So goodness only knows what the top secret information is relating to the same phenomenon. But simply putting those things together, I've been able to say to my military friends, there's a lot of credibility to it. Wormholes and stargates are studied by NASA. They have empirical data on it, and the ancient culture of Sumeria had knowledge of it and put descriptions of it into their ancient texts. So if you expected to find an ancient stargate on planet Earth, you would go to Iraq. And in my other research for Echoes of Eden, I've discovered not only there are other parts of the planet where these phenomena seem to exist and where the folklore and the indigenous knowledge has information relating to them.
And once again, the powers that be keeping it, secret from the plebs as much as they can, holding the information to themselves. Mm.
That's right. So that's right. The information is sequestered. If there is a located Stargate in Iraq, it will certainly not be in a theme park. It will be protected by military. It will be protected by UNESCO. All the most interesting things are in the vaults of our museums. So that's what happens. And it means that the information goes to two places. It goes to the elites who knows what are in the secret vaults, and then it goes to the substratum of the folklore, the indigenous knowledge. But all those of us in mainstream society don't hear or know anything about it.
Yeah. It's in your book that I had to copy because I want to quote it. It's got something that's quite intriguing. You talk about Jan Thomas, employed by the Pentagon in 1960s to provide analysis of UFO phenomenon. His writing touched on areas of human potential, including self-healing, remote viewing, and astral travel. It also argued that hidden in plain sight in the pages of the Bible are references to previous civilizations, paleo contact, planetary resets, and an ET layer to the story of figures referenced in the Bible, including Ezekiel and Jesus. Planetary resets. Everybody thinks that that's what we're in the middle of now. What do you have to say about that?
Well, yes, there is some kind of resetting going on. The kind of planetary reset that Chen Thomas was talking about was quite violent. And he talked about the reversing of the poles, what that would actually do to the planet if that happened. And I don't know if that was the reason that the CIA had studied and redacted his book. I don't know why they bothered redacting it, because people have had access to it all this time. if they were interested in previous civilizations, if they were looking for lost technology, if they were interested in contact with other species referenced in the book. I don't know what the particular thing was, but that was one theory about planetary resets. Plato had another, and 2,500 years ago, he was saying that the planet, and yes, he described the Earth as a planet, as an orb in space. He said that we are impacted on a regular basis by objects moving through space. And the way he puts it, well, it could be an asteroid, it could be the arrival of a moon, it could be other resets, but that it would cause cataclysms on planet Earth to the extent it would take civilization back to a virtual zero, and maybe even land life on Earth to a virtual zero, to have to re-evolve and redevelop. He believed this happened every 5,000 years or so, and he got that figure from Solon, who got that figure from the remnant of the ancient Egyptian priesthood. Now, Solon was a real historic person. He was a Greek legislator. He had spent time with Egyptian priests, a remnant of those who knew how to read the hieroglyphics, and they told him that story of planetary resets, and they said they got that information from the survivors of Atlantis. And that's where the Atlantis story comes from. That is the place, that's the source of information about Atlantis, which is the previous civilization that everybody knows about, if we are looking for a name. But if you're looking for megalithic remains, you can go plenty of places. You can go to southeast Turkey, to Göbekli Tepe, to a megalithic site that was clearly the tail end of a very significant global culture. I say global because the emblems etched into the stonework can be found all around the planet. And around about 8,000 years ago, that was the final end of that, when it was buried for its protection. You can go off the coasts of Yonaguni-jima of Japan, or the Gulf of Cambay, or Malta, or Cuba, and you can find the remains of cities that were above sea level no more recently than 12,000 years ago. And there's a lot of data that points to that period as being the last time civilization went to a virtual zero and had to reboot. So Plato's 5,000 years might not be accurate, because 12,000 years we haven't been obliterated. Maybe we're due another one. There's all kinds of resets going on at the moment, but I think a lot of that has to do with argy-bargy at the non-human layer of our planet's governance. And all our indigenous cultures talk about a non-human layer to the governance of humanity. It's there in the Bible, and that's where I first came across the concept of the Sky Council in the Bible, and realized it was offering us information to explain why things work the way they do on planet Earth. And clearly our ancestors felt that until you realize there's a non-human layer to our governance, you won't understand anything that goes on in the world of international politics.
So that non-human governance, is it a benevolent thing or a malevolent thing?
It would seem to be both. So, that conflict that we read in Genesis 3, which is the Bible's summary of the story of Enlil and Enki, these two factions fighting over how intelligent, how happy, how healthy, how long-lived the humans should be, and one wants good things for us and the other wants us just managed and suppressed. I think that is the perpetual push and pull on the Sky Council. I think there are probably far more demographics sitting in council now than when the Sumerians wrote those stories. It was a couple of Christmases ago that Hayam Eshed, the brigadier general who was chief of space security for Israel for 27 years, stepped up to the mic and said, on the basis of his understanding, informed by that incredible background of work, there is an intergalactic, actually he called it a galactic federation, that clearly has a hands-on involvement in Project Earth, but it's chosen not to self-disclose until you and I, the general public, have a better understanding of what space is, which was a very intriguing phrase, but his language of galactic federation suggests a great many demographics feeling they have a stakeholding in Project Earth. And some may be here because they're interested in what the planet has to offer. They're not interested in us. We may even be an inconvenience. Some may be here because they regard us as resources. But some are here, and I think almost all the stories of first contact in indigenous cultures say that some are here because they love human beings. They think we're amazing, and they want to support our progress as a species. And the first contact stories you read in the Bible, or you can hear in Brazil, or in ancient Greece, in parts of Africa, it's stories of beings arriving and sitting with our ancestors and working with us to bring us to the point where we have agriculture, where we know what plants are good for food, what are good for medicines, which ones are good to avoid, and how to cultivate them. And as soon as you can cultivate them, you can create surpluses and security. And then you can build towns, and then you can become a civilization. And it was that kind of helpful input that defines the stories of first contact of many cultures. And I find that very encouraging. I believe those demographics are still around. They're still sitting in council with the others. But I think there's a little bit more leakage to that non-disclosure agreement, and a little bit more argy-bargy between the factions right now, which is why I think we're seeing such a battle to set the agenda for the next period. And I think reset is the right language for it, but I don't think it's predetermined what the reset means. One of the reasons I'd love there to be more transparency about the contact that our governments have with extraterrestrial civilizations is I would really like to know who's representing us at that table and in whose interests decisions are being made. And I think clearly the order of the day is that we do very clever diplomacy, because you think about us as a species, what power could we possibly have at that table if the others at that table are advanced enough they can get here from impossibly distant parts of the cosmos? What power do we have? What accords can we make? It would be like a mouse sitting down with a lion agreeing that it's going to get eaten. But if we've got advanced friends on that council, friends from the Pleiades, friends from Sirius, then it becomes a question of where do we sit on the table for our best advantage. And I think the Eisenhower story of treaty and contact relates to that, what people might call exopolitics. And that's what I hope is happening, that we're sitting with our friends on that table to ensure a better future for humanity.
Well, I sure hope that our media magnates do not, cheers at that table.
Yeah. Yes, I'm with you there, Sandie.
So, this is an body of work that you've created, really, to pull all of this together. And with your background and credibility factor, it is incredibly persuasive. And, and we know that the governments definitely believe in all this, because they wouldn't be piling so much money into searching for wormholes and all of the research that they're doing. Have you come across any great mediums, and we know that various presidents have used them, who could communicate with some of those people at that council?
Well, that's a very good question. And that was high on the agenda for the US government in the 1950s when they were considering how to manage the contact that was going on, because there was a spat of UFO encounters. And then there were also, how can I put it, sightings of craft passing by us or monitoring us from a little further away. And the governments wanted to know, who are you, what do you want, how do we communicate with them? And it was to mediums that they turned. But, I think more of us have more contact with our cosmic neighbors than we probably suspect. I know a few people who would describe themselves as mediums or psychics or sensitives who would say that among their invisible team of helpers, they certainly have contact with beings who are extraterrestrial, and they may be very specific about where they're from. They're from the Pleiades or they're from Sirius, and they get communication from them. And I think that's right. I find that reassuring. I mean, if I really thought it was only covert government that had contact with cosmic neighbors, I really would be worried. But I think if you listen and take seriously the testimony of experiences of contactees, it's not only at that level that contact is going on. So, for instance, just as an illustration, think about the famous encounter at Rua in Zimbabwe in 1990 at Ariel School, where there were 80 craft that landed just beyond the school perimeter, beings who got out and interacted with the children and had conversations with the children about us, about our planet, about how we're living on the planet. And that kind of contact, that kind of conversation with children, again, is ages old, and again, it's global. So I think there's communication going on at every level, from school children, and they were kids who would have been primary school children. And you can watch those children report those experiences only days after it happened. If you go to James Fox's movie, The Phenomenon, there's footage there that you can find of the children being interviewed by Harvard professor John Mack. And you listen to them and you ask yourself, are they telling the truth? Ask yourself what this conversation means. So we've got contact with children, we've got contact with sensitives, we've got contact with covert government, and maybe you and I, Sandie, have contact that we haven't quite identified as well, that could be part of that. 1 John 4 in the New Testament teaches Christians, taught Christians from the very beginning, to expect to have contact experiences and to expect to be receiving information from entities that the writer never defines what they are. He calls them spirits, but a spirit can be a physical being in some cultures, or it can be a physical being that communicates telepathically, or it can be an energy base, but he doesn't say what it is. He just says, expect to have contact, expect to get information, and weigh it up. Don't give your sovereignty away. You're still in charge of you. Just believe what you think is credible. Do what you think is positive. But if you're willing to weigh things up, you're going to be getting good information. And I think if we listen to each other's experiences and stories, we'll realize that we are actually awash with contact. And that's probably what reassures me more than anything in these uncertain times.
Yeah. People talk about angels, others talk about ascended masters, some talk about their guides. But everybody seems to be having guidance of some kind. I wish we had longer to talk, Paul. There's so much here we could discuss, but we are almost out of time now. At the end of your book, you talk about, towards the end, Plato's vision in a conversation that came out with a friend of yours. And in that vision, you also mentioned the fact that, we each have an invisible team of entities help us. I think that's something that people need to take away from this. It is a very positive thing, and we should all be doing whatever it takes to reactivate those abilities that we have.
Absolutely. And that's really why I wrote Echoes, because there has to be a take home. Can I have a better human experience than this? Can we have a better human experience than this? And our ancestors say yes, and absolutely, and they hold the information that helps us make that a reality.
Paul, thank you for joining us today. I know you're writing another book. I can't wait to read that one. But thank you so much, especially for getting up so early today.
Thanks, Sandie. It's always a pleasure. And thank you for the attention you've given to my books. I really appreciate it.
Oh, they're well worth reading. So, Echoes of Eden, what secrets of human potential were buried with our ancestors' memories of ET contact. That is the third book in this trilogy. Thoroughly recommend them all. And that brings us to the end of this 3-part series of Paul's best-selling trilogy. You can find out more about the books and his healing and coaching services at his website, paulanthonywallis.com. And you can also watch more interviews and documentaries on ancient revelations on the Fifth Kind TV channel on YouTube. And one final heads up. You heard this before anybody else. Paul Wallis will be on the show on December the 8th, along with friend Eric von Daniken, to discuss Eric's new book, Evolution On, which will be released in December, and I'm really looking forward to that one. So that brings us to the end of this week's show. Sedgbeer. I'll be back again at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me and from my friend Paul Wallis.